Hello, we are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are touching on a very human and very vulnerable topic, the feeling of being lost in life. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through the language of self-discovery and finding your way back to yourself.
And I am Abel. I'm so glad to be here with you, Anna. It is a feeling many of us know, that moment when you look around and feel like you are not where you are supposed to be. Today, we want to talk about how to describe these feelings in English and why being lost is often the first step to finding a better path.
That is such a beautiful way to introduce this, Abel. And I want to start by saying something very important before we dive in. If you are listening to this podcast right now and you feel lost, confused, or uncertain about your life, I want you to know that you are in exactly the right place, not just on this podcast, but in your life. The confusion you are feeling is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's often a sign that something inside you is growing and changing. And today, we are going to explore that idea together in slow, clear English so that you can follow along, practice, and maybe even find a little comfort in these words.
I really appreciate you saying that, Anna, because honestly, I have felt this way before. And when I was younger, maybe around 24 or 25, I remember waking up one morning and thinking, what am I doing with my life? I had finished my studies, I had a job, but something felt completely wrong, like I was wearing someone else's shoes and trying to walk in them. They were the right size, but they just did not feel like mine.
That image of wearing someone else's shoes is so powerful, Abel, and I think many people listening right now can connect with that feeling. In English, we have many ways to describe this emotional state. Let us start by looking at some of the most common adjectives and phrases. When we feel lost, we might say we feel directionless. That word, directionless, means without a clear direction or goal. We might also say we feel adrift. To be adrift is like being a small boat on a big ocean with no engine and no wind. You're just floating. You're not sinking, but you're not going anywhere either. Another very common word is purposeless, which means without a sense of purpose or meaning. And then we have the phrase feeling stuck, which means you feel like you can't move forward even though you want to. You're not broken, you're just temporarily unable to move.
Directionless, adrift, purposeless, stuck. These are very strong words, Anna. And what's interesting is that I think I used all of them at different moments during that period of my life. Sometimes I felt stuck, like I was standing in wet cement, and other times I felt adrift, like nothing around me was solid or real.
Yes, and those feelings can shift and change from day to day. That's actually very normal during what psychologists call a life transition. A transition is a period of change between one stage of life and another. It could be the transition from student life to working life. It could be the transition from one relationship ending and a new one beginning. Or it could be a deeper, more internal transition where your values and beliefs about what you want from life are quietly changing. These moments of transition are almost always uncomfortable, and discomfort in English and in life is often the feeling we get just before we grow.
You mentioned psychologists, Anna. There's actually a specific psychological term for the kind of lost feeling that many young adults experience, is there not? I think I've heard the phrase quarter-life crisis. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Abel. The quarter life crisis is a very real and very well documented psychological experience. The term itself is a play on the phrase midlife crisis, which most people have heard of. A midlife crisis typically happens to people in their 40s or 50s when they start to question the choices they made in the first half of their life. The quarter life crisis, on the other hand, happens much earlier, usually between the ages of 20 and 30, roughly a quarter of the way through a typical human life. And it's characterized by feelings of anxiety, uncertainty, and deep questioning about one's identity, direction, and purpose. Research by the British psychologist Oliver Robinson found that approximately 80% of people in their 20s experience some version of this crisis. So if you're in that age range and you feel lost, you're not alone. You are, in fact, part of an overwhelming majority.
80%? That's an extraordinary number. And yet, when I was going through that period, I felt like I was the only one. Everyone around me seemed to have a plan. They seemed to know exactly where they were going and exactly what they wanted. And I was just standing there in the middle of everything, completely unsure.
And that brings us to something very important that we need to talk about, Abel, because what you're describing is not just a personal feeling, it's a modern phenomenon that is made much worse by something very specific: social media. Let's talk about what I call the comparison trap. The comparison trap is the habit, often unconscious, of measuring your own life against the lives you see other people living. And social media is essentially a machine designed to make this comparison happen constantly, automatically, and in a very distorted way.
I know exactly what you mean. When I was feeling most lost, I would open my phone and see people from school posting about their new promotions, their beautiful apartments, their travels, their relationships, and every single post felt like a reminder that I was falling behind, like there was a race happening and I hadn't even found the starting line yet.
That feeling of falling behind is so painful, but here's what we need to understand about social media and comparison. What you see on someone else's profile is never the full picture. It's a highlight reel. It's the best, most polished, most photogenic moments of a person's life, carefully chosen and presented. Nobody posts about the morning they cried before work. Nobody posts about the relationship that is slowly falling apart. Nobody posts about the job they took because they felt lost and needed money, not because it was their dream. So when you compare your internal experience with all of its mess and uncertainty and confusion to someone else's external presentation, which is curated and filtered, you're making an unfair comparison. You're comparing your behind the scenes to their highlight reel, and that comparison will always make you feel worse.
That phrase, highlight reel, is a great one, Anna, and you're absolutely right. I actually remember meeting a friend a few years after that difficult period, and he had been one of those people whose life looked perfect online. Beautiful photos, new job announcements, everything. But when we finally sat down and talked honestly, he told me he had been deeply unhappy for years and had no idea what he actually wanted. He was performing a life that looked good, not living a life that felt good.
That story is so telling, Abel. Performing a life versus living a life, that distinction is crucial. And I think one of the first steps out of the comparison trap is to make a conscious decision to redirect your attention. Instead of looking outward at what others appear to have, you begin to look inward at what you actually feel, want, and need. This is not selfish. This is, in fact, the most honest and productive thing you can do when you feel lost. You have to stop navigating by other people's maps, because their map will never fit your territory.
I love that. Their map will never fit your territory. So then, Anna, what do you do when you feel completely lost and you do not even have your own map? Where do you even begin?
This is where I want to share one of my favorite metaphors for being lost in life, and it is the metaphor of being lost in a forest. Imagine you are walking through a very large, very dense forest. You were following a path, but at some point you took a wrong turn, or perhaps the path simply disappeared. Now you are standing among the trees, and you cannot see the sky clearly, and you do not know which direction leads out. In this moment, most people's instinct is to panic, to run, to make fast, desperate decisions to find the edge of the forest as quickly as possible. But experienced forest navigators and survival experts will tell you something very different. They will tell you to stop, to sit down, to breathe, to look around and notice what is actually there.
That sounds counterintuitive. When I am lost, the last thing I want to do is stop moving.
Exactly. And that is the trap. Because when we are emotionally lost in life, we often do the same thing. We panic, we make hasty decisions, we take the first job offer just to feel like we are moving, we enter a relationship just to feel less alone. We fill our time with busyness so we do not have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. But stopping, truly stopping and observing, is often the bravest and most productive thing you can do. Now, back to the forest. When you stop and look around, you begin to notice things. You notice that there is moss growing on one side of the trees, which can help you orient yourself. You notice that the light is brighter in one direction, which might indicate a clearing. You notice dry wood on the ground, which means you can build a fire if you need warmth. And slowly, through careful observation rather than panicked running, you begin to gather the skills and information you need to find your way.
So the forest teaches you things that you would never have learned if you had stayed on the clear, easy path. That is a profound idea, Anna.
It truly is, and this is what many philosophers and psychologists have observed about periods of being lost in life. The forest, meaning the period of confusion and uncertainty, is not just an obstacle between you and your destination. It is, in many ways, the most important part of the journey, because in the forest, you build resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover from difficulty, to adapt and keep going even when things are hard. In the forest, you develop your intuition. Intuition is that quiet internal sense of what feels right or wrong, which grows stronger the more you are forced to listen to it. And in the forest, you discover what you truly value, because when you have nothing external to guide you, you have to turn inward and find your own compass.
Finding your own compass. I think that is exactly what happened to me during that difficult period. I started to ask myself questions I had never really asked before. Not what should I do, but what do I actually care about? Not what others expect from me, but what feels genuinely meaningful to me. And those questions were uncomfortable, but they were also the most important questions I had ever asked.
And asking those questions is itself a form of navigation. Now, I want to address something very practical, because I know our listeners are also here to learn English, and I want to give them a real, usable tool. One of the most powerful practices for navigating a period of feeling lost is journaling, specifically journaling in English if you are a language learner, because writing your thoughts in a second language is a deeply interesting and clarifying process.
Can you explain why journaling in English is especially helpful, Anna? I think that is a really interesting idea.
Of course, when we write in our native language, we often write on autopilot. The words come automatically, and sometimes they carry with them all of our habitual thoughts and patterns. But when we write in a second language, we are forced to slow down. We have to search for the right word. We have to construct our sentences more carefully. And in that process of slowing down and searching, something interesting happens. We often see our own thoughts more clearly. We gain a kind of distance from them. Instead of being inside the feeling, we are standing slightly outside it, trying to describe it. And that small shift in perspective can create enormous clarity.
That is fascinating. So writing slowly in English forces you to be more deliberate, more thoughtful about what you are actually feeling.
Precisely. And for our listeners who want to try this, I want to suggest some specific journal prompts in English. A journal prompt is a question or sentence starter that you respond to in writing. The first prompt is, right now I feel lost because, and then you finish that sentence honestly. The second prompt is, the life I am living now feels different from the life I imagined because, and the third one is, one small thing that I genuinely enjoy or care about. These prompts are designed to move you from vague, overwhelming feelings to more specific, manageable thoughts. And specificity, being precise and clear about what you feel, is incredibly powerful. You cannot solve a problem you cannot describe, but the moment you can articulate it, give it language and shape, it becomes something you can work with.
I'm going to use those prompts myself, Anna, and I think the third one is particularly interesting. One small thing that I genuinely enjoy or care about. Because when we feel lost, we sometimes think we need to find our grand purpose, our big passion, our ultimate reason for being. But maybe it's smaller than that, at least at first.
You have touched on something absolutely central to this conversation, Abel, and I want to spend some time here. We live in a culture that celebrates big leaps, the dramatic career change, the bold move to a new city, the sudden transformation. And while those things do happen and they can be wonderful, they are not the primary way that most people find their direction. Most people find their direction through small steps, through tiny, almost invisible choices made day after day that slowly, gradually, like a ship changing its course by just 1 degree, lead them somewhere completely different.
The ship metaphor is a good one. If a ship changes direction by just 1 degree at the start of its journey, after a long voyage, it ends up in a completely different place.
Exactly right. And this is so important for people who feel lost because they often believe that the solution must be as dramatic as the problem feels. If I feel completely lost, I must need a completely new life. But that is rarely true. Often, what you need is not a new map, but simply the willingness to take the next right step. Not the next 10 steps, not the entire route, just the very next step. And the next right step is usually something small. It is saying yes to an invitation you would normally decline because you might meet someone interesting. It is taking a class in something you have always been curious about without any expectation that it will lead anywhere. It is reading one book on a topic that genuinely interests you. It is having one honest conversation with one person you trust. These small steps feel insignificant in the moment, but they are, in truth, the building blocks of a new direction.
I remember the small step that changed my direction during my own lost period. I signed up for a pottery class, of all things. I had no idea why. I just saw a flyer, and something about it felt right. And I did not become a potter, but in that class, I met someone who told me about a volunteer program that eventually led me to a completely different career path. One small, seemingly random step. One small yes.
And that story beautifully illustrates something that I think is one of the most liberating ideas about being lost. The most interesting and meaningful parts of our lives very often emerge from the periods when we have no plan. When we are open, unscheduled, and uncertain, we are also, in a strange way, available to new people, new ideas, new directions that we would have completely missed if we had been rigidly following a predetermined path.
So not having a plan can actually be an advantage, even though it feels so frightening in the moment.
It can be, yes. And I want to be careful here because I am not suggesting that planning is bad or that ambition is wrong. Those things are valuable, but there is a difference between intentional planning and compulsive planning driven by fear. When we plan out of fear of uncertainty, we close ourselves off to possibilities. When we stay open, when we allow ourselves to be uncertain without being paralyzed by that uncertainty, we create space for life to surprise us. In Japanese philosophy, there's a concept called which roughly translates to negative space or the meaningful pause. It's the silence between the musical notes that gives the melody its shape. And I think our periods of feeling lost are the of our lives. They aren't empty, they are the space in which the next meaningful thing is taking shape, even if we cannot see it yet.
I have never heard that concept before, Anna. The of our lives, the meaningful pause. That reframes the experience of being lost completely. Instead of seeing it as something broken, you see it as something necessary.
Necessary, and even generous. And this leads me to the final thing I want to speak about today, which is the idea of accepting the unknown and redefining what it means to be on track. So many people who feel lost also feel, as you said earlier, Abel, like they are behind their peers, behind some imaginary schedule, behind where they thought they would be by now. And I want to gently challenge that feeling.
Please do, because I think it is one of the most painful parts of feeling lost. Not just the confusion itself, but the judgment we attach to it, the feeling that we're failing some kind of test.
Yes, and here's the truth. There is no test. There is no schedule. The timeline that you believe you are behind is not a real objective thing. It's a social construction. It's made up of expectations absorbed from your family, your culture, your social media feed, your comparison with friends. And these expectations differ enormously from person to person, from culture to culture, from generation to generation. The idea that you must have a stable career by 25, a partner by 28, a house by 30, is not a law of nature. It's a story. And like all stories, it can be rewritten.
Rewriting the story. I like that. So how do we actually do that in practice, Anna? How do we redefine success on our own terms?
We begin with language because the words we use to describe our lives shape how we experience them. Instead of saying, I'm behind, we practice saying, I'm on my own timeline. Instead of saying, I'm lost, we practice saying, I'm in a period of discovery. Instead of saying, I don't know what I'm doing, we practice saying, I'm learning what matters to me. These are not empty affirmations. They are more accurate descriptions of what is actually happening. Because the truth is, you are not behind. You are human. You are navigating a complex, uncertain, beautiful life without a manual. And the fact that you're questioning, searching, and feeling deeply is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of consciousness. It's a sign that you are awake to your own life, paying attention, and caring about what it means.
Anna, I think what you're saying is that the willingness to feel lost, to sit with uncertainty rather than running from it, is actually a form of courage.
It is one of the greatest forms of courage there is. And I want to leave our listeners with this final thought. Throughout history, the people who have created meaningful lives, who have contributed something real and lasting to the world, who have found genuine happiness and purpose, are almost never the people who had a perfect plan and followed it without deviation. They are the people who were willing to be lost, who were willing to not know, who were willing to take one small step forward in the dark, trusting that the ground would be there beneath their feet. Your confusion right now is not a dead end, it's a crossroads. And crossroads, though they feel overwhelming, are among the most powerful places a person can stand.
This conversation has genuinely moved me, Anna. I came into it thinking we would talk about vocabulary and phrases, and we did, but we also talked about something much bigger, about how to be human in a time of uncertainty. And I think every single person listening, whether they're learning English or learning about life or both, has heard something today that they needed to hear.
And that, ultimately, is why we are here together on this journey, because language is never just grammar and vocabulary. Language is the tool we use to understand ourselves, to reach across the distance between one human heart and another, and to say in whatever words we have, you are not alone in this, and the path you cannot yet see is already beginning to form beneath your feet.